John Paul Jones is probably the most famous naval officer in American history. His name, by the way, was not John Paul Jones. His name was John Paul. And John Paul was born in Scotland, grew up near the coast, and went to sea at an early age. Ended up sailing in the West Indies in a somewhat obscure kind of way. The records are not always clear. John Paul got into a bit of difficulty on one of his cruises. He was captain of a small vessel. And this difficulty resulted in the death of one of his seamen. And so he was accused of murder. So he decided to perhaps change his venue. And so he came to America, came to Virginia, right on the eve of the American Revolution. Good timing. He arrived just in time as the revolution was getting underway. He had some political connections in the Continental Congress, and he used them to get a commission in the Continental Navy. In the very early days of the Revolution, he was commissioned a lieutenant in the Continental Navy. One of his first voyages was with Isaac Hopkins. An American fleet actually sailed from Philadelphia and captured the Bahama Islands. And Jones was one of the officers in that successful expedition. His reputation grew, and after that he took command of ever larger vessels as the war went on. But John Paul Jones always wanted a bigger ship, always wanted a bigger ship. He was something of an annoyance to the Congress, pestering them all the time. And so finally, the decision was made that they'll send John Paul Jones to France, and he can pester Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, of course, was our representative in France, and most people thought that Franklin could get almost anything out of the French. And so the thought was, well, Jones will go to France, and Franklin will get the French to give Jones a big ship. So Jones sailed to France in the sloop of war Ranger, which had been built in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He gets to France and begins his lobbying for a larger ship, but without much success, and he becomes as much of a pest to Franklin as he had been to the Congress in Philadelphia. And so Jones, instead of getting a bigger ship, takes Ranger and sails around the British Isles, sails up in the Irish Sea, up to a place called Belfast in Northern Ireland. And there in the harbor of Belfast, Ranger engaged in a battle with a British warship, HMS Drake. And it's one of those, as they would say in the 18th century, a rollicking engagement in which Jones wins. It's quite significant that an American continental naval vessel beats one of His Majesty's vessels. And so Jones then returns back to France, his reputation enhanced, certainly, and still pestering for a bigger ship. I want a bigger ship because, as he once put it, I intend to sail in harm's way. Well, finally, Franklin comes through, and he gets the French to offer to him and to Jones a larger vessel. It's an old East Indiaman. That is to say, this is a fairly large sailing vessel that has been used in the trade with the East Indies, not the West Indies, but all the way to the East Indies. She's old, she's cranky, as they might say, a little bit leaky. She isn't very beautiful. Her name is the Duke of Duras. That's her French name, the Duke of Duras. So Jones, seeing this as frankly, his only opportunity, he's not keen on taking the ship, but on the other hand. And so he takes command, and then, in order to honor Franklin, he renames the ship Bonhomme Richard, Good Man Richard, which is intended to honor Benjamin Franklin for his role as being the publisher of Poor Richard's Almanac. So now they have to outfit the Bonhomme Richard to prepare for this epic voyage against the British. And they do. Jones sets sails in Bonhomme Richard, along with a few other smaller vessels. And their goal is to sail all around the British Isles, terrify the British Isles, and show them just what the American Continental Navy can do. So aboard Bonhomme Richard, Jones starts his voyage to glory. Well, it's not a very glorious voyage. They don't find any rich convoys. They don't engage in any rollicking engagements, as they say. And the crew's getting a little frustrated, and so too is John Paul Jones. Until finally, they're heading south along the east coast of England, near a place called Flamborough Head. And as they're coming down the coast, they capture a local English fisherman. And they ask the fisherman, what's happening? What's going on in the neighborhood? And the fisherman tells him that everybody ashore is rather excited because the Baltic fleet is due home at almost any moment. The Baltic fleet is very important to the Royal Navy. Ever since the Revolution had begun, the Royal Navy no longer had access to naval stores, tar, pitch, turpentine, from the colonies. And so they had turned to the Baltic. And they were importing all of this material, which was absolutely essential to the Royal Navy. It's like oil would be to us today. And so Jones hears now the Baltic fleet. So he decides to hang around a little bit. And it works. They spot the Baltic fleet heading down towards England. Now this is an age of sail. Ships move very slowly. It takes hour upon hour for these two enemies to close on one another. They see one another for a long time as they slowly come together. The Baltic fleet is being escorted by two Royal Navy vessels, HMS Serapis under the command of Captain Pearson, and a smaller vessel called the Princess of Scarborough. As they come close, Bonhomme Richard and Serapis come within hailing distance. They can hear one another. And the story goes, perhaps a bit of exaggeration here, but the story goes that Captain Pearson hails Bonhomme Richard, asking Bonhomme Richard, "Who are you?" And Jones replies, "Princess Royal," which at the very same moment as he replies that, the gun ports fly open and Bonhomme Richard lets loose with a barrage against Serapis. The battle begins. And it is indeed quite a battle between these two sailing warships. The two vessels eventually grapple one another, that is, they come close side by side. It's not going so well for Bonhomme Richard because she's old and doesn't sail quite as well as Serapis does. In the midst of the battle, again one of these pieces of apocryphal perhaps, Pearson is supposed to have called out to Captain Jones, "Sir, do you strike?" And Jones replies, "I have not yet begun to fight." Well, the battle continues. In the midst of the battle, a grenade is thrown over onto Serapis and it explodes, doing severe damage. And so out of this, Serapis surrenders to Jones. Captain Pearson surrenders his sword. They do all they can to save Bonhomme Richard, but she's in such terrible condition that the next day Bonhomme Richard actually sinks. But Jones and his crew, and the British, of course, survivors, and Captain Pearson, all go back to France aboard HMS Serapis. When they get back to France, Jones is an enormous hero. This is an incredible accomplishment. But interestingly enough, when Captain Pearson gets back to London, the king knights him, simply because Captain Pearson did his job. He protected the Baltic fleet. Oh yes, Jones took HMS Serapis, but he didn't take the fleet. And so Pearson too is a hero. When Jones hears that Captain Pearson has been knighted, he's supposed to have responded, "The next time I meet him, the king will make him a duke." So Jones goes down in history for that great, and it was an incredible victory. Jones's career after that in the American Revolution is a rather dull one, really. He returns back to America, and he's going to be given command of a ship of the line. During the Revolution, the Continental Congress agreed to build a very large ship of the line. These were the battleships of the 18th century. But here again, something odd happens. During the course of the war, a French ship of the line, La Magnifique, had actually run aground in Boston Harbor and had sunk. To repay the French for their efforts in the war, it's decided that we'll give our own ship of the line, which we have named America, to the French. So Jones gets to command this ship for only a very brief moment of time, actually only enough time to turn her over to the French. So that just doesn't go down very well. After the American Revolution, John Paul Jones becomes a sort of sailor of fortune. He signs on to work for the Empress Catherine of Russia, and he becomes an admiral in the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Apparently, he didn't get along very well with his Russian colleagues, and it wasn't a very successful story. So he comes back to Paris, And while he's in Paris in the early 1790s, he's actually given a minor government appointment by the American government. He's going to be an agent for prisoners. But in any case, he really has no great fame now. His fame is more or less diminished. And he dies in Paris. And he's buried in a Protestant cemetery. And over the generations, the Protestant cemetery is more or less forgotten. And certainly John Paul Jones is sort of forgotten until Teddy Roosevelt is President of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Teddy Roosevelt is a great naval enthusiast. And Roosevelt is trying to garner public support to increase the size of the American Navy, to get more support for big ships. It's about this time when the United States Minister to France telegraphs the State Department that they have found the body of John Paul Jones, buried in this cemetery. And he was buried, by the way, in a cask of brandy. So the body has been mummified. Well, here's an opportunity. So the President of the United States decides we're bringing back to America our great naval hero. And it is done. He's brought back on the cruiser Brooklyn. Great ceremony, great ceremony. And by the way, for those interested in knowing a bit more about this, there's actually a book published about the return of John Paul Jones's body with photographs. And you can actually see the mummified body. It kind of looks like him, preserved very well. Well, in any case, John Paul Jones is brought back with all of this hoopla. And of course, today he lies in repose at the United States Naval Academy. He's in this grand ceremonial crypt in the basement of the chapel, the Naval Academy, buried in this, not buried, but displayed sort of, in this grand marble sarcophagus that's held aloft by 4 leaping dolphins. So John Paul Jones, this great naval hero, is probably buried in more splendor than I can think of any other American. At the time of the American Revolution, the Royal Navy is mistress of the seas. Britannia's trident, as they say, is sharp and pointed. Probably somewhere between 800 and 1,000 ships in the Royal Navy. Britannia does rule the waves. And then, of course, there's the Continental Navy. It was a bit presumptuous of the Continental Congress to decide to build a navy. But on the other hand, there was a grand seafaring tradition in the American colonies. We were a seafaring community. And so it was logical that we would turn to the sea to defend our liberties and to pester the British. The Congress approves the construction originally of 13 frigates. Now there's a magic number, 13 frigates. Some of them will get built and get to sea. Some of them will never get to sea. Some will be captured. It's not an altogether glorious story. But on the other hand, there are some notable victories by the Continental Navy. Certainly, John Paul Jones is one. And there are other brave captains. Captain Abraham Whipple, for example, commander of the ship Providence. The frigate Providence raids the British Jamaica fleet. Captain Nicholas Biddle turns in a very creditable performance. It's also true, in a kind of curious way, that one of the great naval, not victories, but naval engagements of the American Revolution is fought up on Lake Champlain. It's an American fleet against a British fleet. And who commands the American fleet on Lake Champlain? Benedict Arnold. And it's a battle that's fought early in the war. Benedict Arnold loses to the British fleet, but he manages to delay the British advance down through Lake Champlain 1 year in time for the Americans to prepare to defend themselves in 1777, a year later. So there are numerous examples of individual bravery and courage. But the Continental Navy, inasmuch as one thinks of a navy, is never a serious threat to the Royal Navy. It does pester them, and it does serve a couple of important services to the American cause. One is that it serves as a sort of messenger service between the American colonies and France and the West Indies to some degree. So money, for example, French gold that needs to be brought in is brought in by Continental Navy ships. Diplomats that have to be transported. John Adams, for example, goes to France. Benjamin Franklin, of course, and other American diplomats are transported in American vessels, Continental Navy vessels. So they do serve a purpose, but there's certainly no challenge to Britannia. And by the end of the American Revolution, there's only one Continental Navy vessel left. She's the Alliance, is her name. And she, right after the war is over, is sold out of service again. And the United States will not have another Navy, will not have a Navy until the presidency of George Washington in the Federal Republic and the formation of the United States Navy. It is interesting and important to note that several officers who end up to be very important in the new Federal Navy under George Washington saw their first service in the Continental Navy. So there is a tradition, there is a heritage there of naval activity. That is not to say, however, even though the Continental Navy was not necessarily a key player in the Revolution, navies were a key player in the American Revolution. And in point of fact, the victory of the Americans in the American Revolution is in great measure due to naval victories, but not naval victories by the Continental Navy. The life of a sailor at sea. We should always remember, a ship never sleeps. A ship never sleeps. When a ship is underway, it is 24 hours a day. She's underway, must always be manned and operated. So sailors live a life cycle, a daily cycle. It's quite different from landsmen. You know, we're accustomed to going to sleep at night and waking in the morning. That's not what it's true for a sailor. A sailor's life is divided into watches. Watches are about 4 hours each. And a sailor serves beginning at noon, the watches begin. 12 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 12, 12 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 12. Round the clock, with one slight exception. And that is that the watch in the late afternoon, from 4 to 8, that 4-hour watch, is usually cut in half. Or as they use the expression, it is docked. So sailors would serve a watch rather than serving from 4 to 8. You would serve from 4 to 6 and then 6 to 8. They did that so that you would not be required to serve the same watch day after day after day after day. Now the watch itself is timed to the bells. They don't really have clocks at sea. That really hasn't come along well yet. There are chronometers, which are very expensive clocks, but not a lot of ships have those. So time is kept by an hourglass or a half hourglass. So sailors know what time it is at noon, and you always know when it's noon at sea because you can shoot the sun. The sun is at its highest point at noon, so you know precisely when it's noon. At noon, someone on the quarterdeck rings the bell 8 times. Then you know it is noon. And then someone will turn the half-hour glass, the sand glass. When the sand glass, that half-hour glass, is emptied, someone will strike the bell once. When the glass is turned and you get to the hour, you strike the bell twice. And that will go on 3 bells, 4 bells, 5 bells, 6 bells, 7 bells. And then, when 4 hours is up, 8 bells. At 8 bells on board a vessel, half the crew is happy and the other half's not so happy. Because half the crew is about to go off watch and the other half's about to come on watch. And so that would be the routine aboard a sailing vessel. 24 hours a day divided into watches. Men would eat together in what was called a mess. And usually the way the mess worked is there was a central place where the food was prepared, as much as you could call it food. And one member of the messes were maybe 6 or 8 men together, one member of the mess would be assigned to go get the food. And so he would go and get the food from the cook and bring it back, and it was family dining, and you'd put the food in the middle, and then that they would all consume the food. The food consisted of actually fairly generous portions usually that have peas and cheese, hardtack, which is a very hard kind of bread, and then they would have beef, salted beef, heavily salted beef. The cook would prepare the beef. The beef was kept in casks of salt water to keep it salted. And when he was going to serve it, he'd take the beef out of the cask or out of the barrel at least a day before it was to be prepared. And he'd put it in fresh water, hoping that that fresh water would in fact take much of that salt out of the beef. The cask into which the beef was being readied before it was being served was referred to by the sailors as the harness cask. And the reason they called it the harness cask is that they always accused the cook of buying horse meat, and indeed not only horse meat, but the harness of the horse as well. So it was called the harness. After the beef was as much salt as they could get out of it was taken out, then it would be cooked and served. So that would be the sort of the main part of the meal, would be this salted beef. And they would get, again, usually in ample portions. On long voyages, which the Continental Navy really did not engage in, but other vessels on long voyages during the 18th century, seamen worry about disease because you're in a very confined element. You're in an oaken box. And within that oaken box, when dysentery breaks out, or typhus breaks out, or any number of diseases that you can imagine, highly contagious. And so when you went to sea as a sailor in the Navy, being killed in combat was not your great worry. Your great worry was dying of disease, or, by the way, dying from an accident, falling out of the rigging. That would certainly ruin your entire day. So accidents and disease were the most famous disease, I suppose, that seamen suffered from was scurvy. All of the food that they ate was usually heavily preserved, usually wasn't fresh, and so it lacked vitamin C. They knew nothing about vitamin C, but scurvy would break out because the men did lack it. Scurvy was a terrible disease. Your joints swell up, your teeth fall out, you get terrible headaches, and you die. So going to sea could be relatively dangerous, but not so much for sailors as you would think. It's not so much in battle. It was everything else that might come upon you. The life of a sailor in this very fixed routine, and it is a very fixed routine, is probably pretty dull. I remember someone once remarked that a day at sea was 23 hours of complete and total boredom and 1 hour of sheer terror. And I think that probably sums up what it was like to go to sea in the 18th century in the Continental Navy and the British Navy. Much of going to sea routine, but oh, those moments of terror. The American Revolution has a sort of geographic history. It begins in New England. Then after New England, the British evacuate Boston in March of 1776. The focus of the war moves to the middle colonies, moves to New York, Pennsylvania. After a couple years down there, about 3 years down there, the British realize that it's pretty much of a stalemate in the middle colonies, and so they turn their attention to the South. They believe that in the South they'll find lots of Tories, lots of support. And so they shift their emphasis to the South, to Charleston, to Savannah. And they begin to try to subdue the South. That doesn't go very well either. In 1781, the British general in command of the British Army in the South, General Cornwallis, decides that his campaign in the Carolinas is not succeeding. And so he makes the decision to take his army and march it north to Virginia. His goal is twofold. One, he thinks that he may have more success in Virginia, and the other is that he's going to march his army to the coast of Virginia, to a place called Yorktown. There at Yorktown, he hopes that the British Navy will arrive either to bring troops to reinforce him or to help him leave. The British commander-in-chief in North America, General Cornwallis's superior, is General Sir Henry Clinton, and he commands in New York City. And so Cornwallis is depending then upon General Clinton to get his messages that he's coming to Virginia, coming to Yorktown, send help. It's a long march from the Carolinas all the way up to Virginia, and a number of small battles are fought. No great decisive battle, but at each battle, General Cornwallis grows weaker. He's losing men that he cannot replace, and the Americans are chasing him. Finally, he gets to Yorktown. And there at Yorktown, he builds entrenchments to defend himself. While Cornwallis is moving towards Yorktown, the Americans are making their move. General Washington was up on the Hudson River with his army, watching the British in New York City. General Rochambeau, the French commander who has arrived, is with his army in Rhode Island. When Washington and Rochambeau realize what is happening in Virginia, that is that Cornwallis with his army is marching towards Yorktown, towards the Virginia coast, they come up with an idea. It's a very risky proposition and a very dangerous one. The plan is to move the French and American forces down south to besiege and take Cornwallis. It is an extraordinary idea for the 18th century. It would be difficult today. We're going to move two major armies simultaneously in secret because, of course, you don't want the British to know what's going on. But the deal is made. The French and the Americans are on the move. In the meantime, General Cornwallis is becoming ever more concerned about his own precarious position. He has his back to the sea. It becomes clear now that whoever controls the sea is going to control this moment. Rochambeau had sent word to the French fleet in the West Indies under the command of Admiral de Grasse. In the 18th century, it was the custom for naval squadrons in the West Indies to get out of there in the hurricane season. And so de Grasse had been in communication with Rochambeau. And de Grasse more or less says to Rochambeau, I think I might come north with my fleet. You got anything for me to do? And all of these things come together in this most miraculous kind of way. Rochambeau, Washington, and de Grasse. And of course Rochambeau says, yeah, come on up. We're moving down to the Chesapeake. We've got this underway. We can use your help. And de Grasse does. In the meantime, General Clinton in New York begins to see what's happening. At first, he doesn't quite see the picture. He doesn't have good spies. He doesn't have the right intelligence. And so he dispatches a British squadron down to the Chesapeake. That British squadron engages with de Grasse at the Battle of the Chesapeake, as it's called. The Battle of the Chesapeake between these French and British forces goes on for a couple of days. It's one of those typical 18th century naval battles at sea. Individual ship engagements, a lot of confusion. Remember, these are vessels powered by sail. You don't just turn the engine on and go starboard or port. But in the end, the British withdraw. It's always been an open question, were the British defeated at the Chesapeake? Well, one might argue that point. But however you might argue the point, in the end, the British fleet withdrew. Once the British fleet had withdrawn, Cornwallis's hopes are sunk. He has no escape, and he will not be reinforced. The Americans and the French, Rochambeau and Washington, now tighten the siege. Bombard continues. It's a traditional, typical 18th century siege. Cornwallis's position is absolutely hopeless. And so, on October the 19th, 1781, Cornwallis's army surrenders to the Franco-American force. We should, by the way, always remember that it was a Franco-American force. In fact, when you tally up the number of soldiers and sailors present at Yorktown, there were far more French than Americans. And that final moment, by the way, on October the 19th, when the surrender ceremony takes place, always a ceremony in the 18th century, the two forces line up. The British lay down their muskets in traditional fashion. And then there's the moment when the general surrenders. Cornwallis wasn't there. He was, he said, ill. He was sulking in his tent. And so instead, he sends out a subordinate, General O'Hara. General O'Hara comes forward to surrender the British sword, and he actually approached General Rochambeau. Rochambeau looked at him and gestured to General Washington as the commander-in-chief. When General O'Hara approached General Washington, Washington too stepped aside. It would not be becoming for the commander-in-chief to accept the surrender from a subordinate officer. And so he invited General Benjamin Lincoln to come forward to take the British surrender. So General Lincoln actually took O'Hara's sword to complete this rather glorious and wonderful surrender. From roughly 1689 until 1815, the world was at war. Peace broke out once in a while, but you had the world's two great superpowers facing one another, France and England. Great imperial powers vying for nothing less than world supremacy. Sometimes they fought through surrogates. Sometimes they fought against one another. And we can go through the list of wars. There's King William's War, Queen Anne's War, the War of Jenkins' Ear, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and then the Napoleonic Wars. All of these wars fought between these two great superpowers. And as they engaged with one another in these wars, they naturally drew in their allies. Spain, tied by family to France, was almost always on France's side. Russia, will come in on the side of the English. Prussia on the side of the English. Austria on the side of the French. And so it goes in this kaleidoscopic 125 years of war. And the American Revolution is one of those wars. It begins, of course, as a war of independence of the American colonies against the British, a kind of family feud. But the French, who are always looking to get even with the British, see an opportunity here. And once they're sure that the Americans, one, are serious about independence, and two, have a fighting chance of getting it, then they join us. Then they join us in this treaty. And so they come in on our side. A little bit later in the war, the Spanish come in on our side. However, the Spanish never sign a treaty of alliance with us. They're allies of France, not of the United States. You see, the Spanish don't feel too kindly towards us because they understand that if you have a vibrant, a powerful American republic, they might not be a good neighbor. And France, both France and Spain, have territories next to us. So Spain comes in on our side. The Dutch join us as well. The Dutch don't provide much in the way of the military, but they send us a lot of cash, okay? And that's very good as well. So these wars then go ebb and flow, and as someone, I think it was perhaps Disraeli once remarked, some great statesman, that nations don't have permanent friends, they only have permanent interests. And the permanent interest here for 125 years is the battle between the French and the British for this world domination. And we triumph. We're most lucky. We could not have won our revolution without French aid. Had not our revolution become part of a greater world war, we would probably be singing God Save the Queen today.